The most dangerous predators do not bare their teeth. They simply smile warmly and ask how your day was. They wear the mask of a comforting friend, presenting an open demeanor designed to disarm the heaviest psychological defenses effortlessly. This is the anatomy of the social parasite, an entity feeding on the flaws of unsuspecting minds. Observe the posture of the self-proclaimed good listener, leaning slightly forward to invade personal boundaries under the guise of empathy. The tilted head simulates deep understanding, an empty stare hiding a dark vault, collecting ammunition. Their conversational entry point is never an attack, but a gentle probing question meant to test the structural integrity of your boundaries. They offer a safe haven for your exhaustion, whispering soft validations while their dark machinery records every tremor. Human nature craves connection in moments of deep distress, making a sympathetic ear the ultimate bait for a masterful emotional manipulator. But empathy requires a genuine emotional investment, a currency the parasite completely lacks and despises. Instead of shared pain, they experience a sudden surge of adrenaline when a heavy secret is finally dropped onto the table. Every confessed weakness is immediately cataloged and silently appraised, an acquired asset saved for the inevitable social transaction. The warm crimson teacup they offer acts as a diversion, distracting the victim from the subtle interrogation tactics being deployed. Notice the artificial symmetry in their comforting smile, a mechanical mimicry of affection devoid of true warmth. They do not wish to heal your open emotional wounds. They only seek the exclusive privilege of inspecting the bleeding edges. To the dedicated gossip, your private tragedy is merely entertainment. A secret traded is not a bond formed. It is a collar fastened tightly around your neck. Watch how the manipulator opens the exchange, dropping a harmless piece of bait to test the social waters. They confess a minor, fabricated flaw of their own, creating an artificial sense of vulnerability and mutual trust. This is the law of social reciprocity weaponized, an invisible scale demanding equal weight in personal and private confessions. When they lower their voice to a confidential whisper, they are not building intimacy, they are setting a psychological snare. The human brain feels an immense, almost unbearable pressure to match their fake vulnerability with a genuine, bleeding truth. You feel obligated to offer a piece of your soul, paying a fabricated debt with your most guarded secrets. Observe the subtle shift in their cold eyes, the exact moment they realize the hook has deeply set in. They nod slowly, absorbing your heavy words, while mentally locking your confession inside their dark, impenetrable vault. The empathy they project is merely a calculated reflection, a mirror designed to make you talk until you are empty. Once the transaction is complete, the warmth vanishes, leaving a chilling realization that you have given away your leverage. You have voluntarily handed them a loaded weapon, trusting it in the hands of a chronic, smiling opportunist. They do not keep secrets, they invest them, waiting for the perfect moment to cash out for maximum social disruption. Your private pain has just been commodified, transformed into shiny currency for their twisted underground market. The empathy trap has successfully snapped completely shut, and you are now inextricably tied to the parasite's hidden agenda. Truth in their hands is merely raw material, waiting to be forged into a devastatingly sharp blade. Once the secret is securely acquired, the facade of confidentiality crumbles, dissolving completely to reveal their true, malicious, overarching intention. They do not merely repeat the fragile confession. They systematically restructure every detail to maximize the catastrophic damage. A simple moment of vulnerable hesitation is aggressively twisted, transforming an innocent admission into a weapon of mass destruction. Watch how the manipulator selectively omits vital context, engineering a completely fabricated narrative to manipulate the surrounding audience. They become the self-appointed architect of dramatic tragedy, sketching false blueprints designed specifically to orchestrate a spectacular social collapse. The whispers are carefully released into the eager crowd, planting microscopic venomous seeds destined to choke the original truth. Their insidious megaphone operates entirely on subtle distortions, ensuring the victim remains completely blind to the rapidly approaching execution. Every single stolen vulnerability is magnified intensely in the shadows, projected outward as a monstrous shadow of irreversible shame. The audience consumes the manufactured scandal with ravenous hunger, blindly accepting the forged narrative without questioning the underlying source. Meanwhile, the architect of this destruction stands back quietly, observing the beautiful chaos they orchestrated from a safe, elevated distance. The victim discovers their private bleeding wound exposed publicly, completely powerless against the tidal wave of meticulously engineered social ruin. This is the true terrifying power of the chronic gossip, possessing the dark supernatural ability to assassinate a character silently. They build their fragile throne upon shattered reputations, rising higher by eagerly stepping on the bleeding corpses of trust. Truth is never a reliable shield. It is merely their preferred weapon of total destruction. They hoard stolen whispers because their own reality is deafeningly hollow and completely devoid of genuine substance. To understand the chronic manipulator, we must examine the void, the dark, bottomless pit of their profound and crippling inferiority. Gossip is not merely an idle pastime for the bored. It is a desperate survival mechanism for a starving psychological parasite. Without the scandalous tragedies of other people to peddle, they become instantly invisible to the society they desperately wish to rule. They crave the temporary spotlight that comes with breaking news, a fleeting moment where everyone stops to absorb their toxic, manufactured poison. In that brief fraction of a second, they feel powerful, an illusion of supreme control masking their pathetic and deeply rooted insignificance. By possessing a piece of the victim's darkest, most guarded shame, they elevate themselves above the miserable mediocrity of their own existence. They construct a majestic, towering throne out of stolen narratives, attempting to rule a kingdom made entirely of fragile, decaying paper secrets. This hunger for covert authority drives their relentless emotional espionage, turning every casual interaction into a highly tactical information extraction mission. But beneath the confident smirk and the knowing, piercing gaze lies a terrified, hollow entity, terrified of their own overwhelming nothingness. If the network of whispers is completely severed, the manipulator rapidly suffocates in the deafening silence of social irrelevance. They are desperate merchants selling stolen goods in the dark, entirely dependent on the morbid curiosity of a deeply flawed social ecosystem. Recognizing this pathetic, crippling dependency is the ultimate tactical advantage, revealing the glaring structural weakness hidden behind their terrifying megaphone of lies. The predator is, in truth, an extremely fragile glass construct, entirely reliant on the target's emotional reaction to maintain its delicate structural integrity. They do not possess actual power. They only borrow it from the victim's agonizingly raw vulnerability. The natural human instinct when targeted is to retreat into the shadows, hoping the storm will eventually pass, without causing permanent structural damage. This is the victim's most fatal miscalculation, believing that quiet endurance is equivalent to a successful and resilient defense. The manipulator does not interpret passive silence as a dignified retreat. They perceive it exclusively as absolute submission and unconditional total surrender. When the target refuses to aggressively defend their own narrative, the architect of lies quickly moves to fill the terrifying empty space. Silence is an incredibly fertile, dark incubator, allowing the tiny seeds of gossip to mutate into undeniable, monstrous truths. The victim locks themselves inside a quiet fortress of isolation, completely unaware that the walls are constructed entirely from explosive materials. Every unspoken defense becomes a heavy brick in their own tomb, sealing them perfectly tight inside a suffocating chamber of manufactured guilt. To the observing crowd, the absence of a fierce denial acts as a damning signature of absolute and undeniable total complicity. They mistake the victim's paralyzing shock for calculated guilt, allowing the forged narrative to effortlessly consume their entire social identity. The architect thrives within this expanding vacuum of absolute silence, painting their grotesque masterpiece across the target's undefended and blank canvas. The desire to maintain graceful peace actively funds the psychological war, providing the enemy with endless ammunition to execute a flawless character assassination. By refusing to step into the blinding light of the arena, the target allows the shadowy predator to dominate the entire narrative battlefield. A whispered lie left completely unchallenged in the dark inevitably crystallizes into a permanent and deeply painful historical public record. Do not foolishly believe that ignoring the creeping venom will cure it. It only grants sufficient time to reach the vital emotional organs. Silence never extinguishes the blazing fire. It simply locks the burning doors from the inside. The truly elite manipulator rarely dirties their own hands. They prefer a much cleaner method to execute their final destructive vision. They craft an elegant illusion of overwhelming public consensus, making the targeted individual firmly believe the entire world has turned hostile. This tactic relies heavily on recruiting unsuspecting third parties, transforming incredibly naive bystanders directly into fiercely loyal and aggressive attack dogs. The predator approaches the crowd wearing a mask of concern, whispering fabricated tragedies carefully designed strictly to trigger the group's protective instincts. They do not openly demand hatred or violent direct retribution. Instead, they softly plant toxic seeds, wrapped in completely fake sympathetic sighs. Watch how the architect steps back into the comfortable shadows, watching the newly radicalized, angry mob tear the isolated victim completely apart. The crowd believes they are dispensing necessary social and moral justice, completely blind to the invisible strings controlling their every single aggressive movement. The victim is crushed not by a single focused enemy, but by the unbearable collective weight of 100 carefully manipulated strangers. When the target attempts to explain their side of the story, the angry mob has already been vaccinated against the absolute objective truth. The manipulator has successfully preempted every single possible defense, framing the desperate pleas for help as clear evidence of mental instability. This orchestrated isolation is a profound form of psychological torture, stripping the target of their basic human need for connection and belonging. The crowd becomes an impenetrable wall of solid, deafening noise, drowning out the quiet, desperate truth with their self-righteous and blinding anger. And if the mob goes too far in their brutal punishment, the architect can simply wash their hands of any direct personal responsibility. They will slowly shake their head and shed a tear, pretending to mourn the horrific tragedy they secretly and deliberately built themselves. The most dangerous weapon is never the assassin's hidden blade. It is the easily influenced minds of a perfectly blind, self-righteous crowd. The most devastating phase of manipulation is not the cruelty itself. It is the calculated and sudden return of artificial and blinding warmth. After a prolonged period of psychological starvation, the predator suddenly offers a tiny crumb of absolute pure manufactured affection. This abrupt shift completely shatters the victim's defensive perimeter, forcing their exhausted mind to desperately search for any logical psychological explanation. The manipulator wears the stolen face of a repentant savior, offering a beautiful but completely hollow promise of permanent and lasting change. They weep convincing tears of sudden profound realization, carefully washing away the bitter memories of their own past undeniable cruelty. To the starving target, this tiny drop of emotional water feels exactly like a massive, raging ocean of genuine and unconditional love. The victim eagerly drinks the intoxicating poison of false hope, willfully erasing the deep structural damage inflicted during the long, dark winter. They begin to vigorously defend their abuser to the world, holding up this single, fragile moment as absolute proof of true redemption. This is the precise architecture of the trauma bond, an invisible chain forged entirely from alternating cycles of extreme emotional pain. The manipulator calibrates this vicious cycle with absolute mathematical precision, ensuring the victim never fully recovers from the last brutal psychological strike. The brief flashes of golden light are strictly weaponized tools, designed only to reset the biological threshold for enduring future relentless abuse. By providing just enough oxygen to keep the target breathing, the architect prevents a total and absolute collapse of the useful supply. The victim becomes addicted to the painful relief of survival, mistaking the temporary cessation of torture for an act of profound mercy. They spend their entire life chasing a phantom ghost, waiting for the loving mask to finally become a permanent living reality. But the mask is rapidly melting away in the dark, revealing the smiling and hungry beast waiting patiently underneath the fragile surface. The final stage of total ownership requires absolute isolation, severing all external ties to ensure the victim cannot escape. The manipulator quietly studies the target's entire social ecosystem, identifying every single structural pillar, holding up their independent reality. Friends and loyal family members are not viewed as people. They are strictly classified as dangerous threats to absolute control. The isolation process does not begin with a loud, violent demand. It starts with a subtle injection of carefully crafted doubt. They plant tiny, invisible seeds of paranoia within the victim's mind, gently suggesting that everyone else harbors secret and malicious intentions. Simultaneously, they begin a preemptive smear campaign in the dark, quietly whispering highly distorted half-truths to the victim's protective circle. The predator portrays themselves as the exhausted and deeply concerned caretaker, secretly painting the actual victim as dangerously unstable and erratic. When the targeted individual finally reaches out for external emotional help, they find a cold wall, constructed entirely from manipulated perceptions. This orchestrated psychological starvation creates a terrifying closed-loop system, where the source of pain becomes the only available comfort. The victim's entire universe slowly shrinks down to a single room, heavily guarded by the smiling architect of their total destruction. Every bridge back to their former healthy, independent life is burned, reduced to a pile of glowing ash in the darkness. They are completely stranded on a desolate psychological island, entirely dependent on the predator for basic emotional survival rations. The manipulator now operates with zero fear of external behavioral interference, enjoying the absolute supreme power over a completely silenced world. The silence of isolation is heavier than any physical iron chain, crushing the last remaining spark of natural and healthy defiance. In this perfect vacuum, nobody can hear the psychological screams until the final discard phase, abruptly and violently, begins now. The discard begins when the target is completely drained. The manipulator suddenly drops the act, exposing the absolute lack of empathy. The golden illusion completely evaporates into dark ash, leaving behind a hollow shell, shattered by years of systematic abuse. The predator looks at their exhausted psychological prize and experiences a profound wave of intense and unadulterated boredom. The victim is no longer a useful source of dynamic fuel. They are merely an annoying remainder of an expired emotional investment. Devaluation shifts from a slow, covert erosion into an open and merciless campaign, designed to totally erase individual worth. Every remaining shred of human dignity is methodically stripped away, as the cold architect walks away, without offering a single word of closure. They treat the target like a broken, disposable plastic toy, tossed carelessly into a landfill of forgotten and completely discarded souls. The victim desperately begs for any logical human explanation, but they are met with a chilling look of complete and utter indifference. The narcissist has already scanned the horizon for a replacement, selecting a fresh, unsuspecting target to begin the vicious cycle all over again. The transition happens with terrifying mechanical efficiency, showing absolutely no trace of remorse for the psychological wreckage left behind. The target faces the brutal truth of their manufactured reality, realizing they were only a temporary pawn in a deeply sinister behavioral game. The abrupt emotional abandonment causes intense neurological shock, forcing the brain to painfully process the devastating absence of the toxic bond. The manipulator completely overwrites the history of the entire relationship, framing the broken victim as the sole instigator of their own tragic ruin. They leave behind a ghost haunted by phantom promises, wandering aimlessly through a barren landscape of permanent and heavy emotional silence. A discarded soul has finally served its purpose and expires. The aftermath of the discard leaves a suffocating and deafening silence, trapping the survivor inside a cold maze of severe cognitive dissonance and pain. Healing does not begin with closure or any heartfelt final apology. It starts with the absolute brutal acceptance of their profound emotional bankruptcy. The trauma bond pulls the victim backward like a heavy iron chain, forcing them to actively wage war against their own toxic neurochemical addiction. Every sweet memory is suddenly recontextualized as a highly calculated predatory move, turning the entire beautiful romantic past into a horrifying psychological crime scene. The manipulator relied on the victim constantly doubting their own core reality, but the heavy, blinding fog finally lifts, revealing the cold, naked truth. Radical acceptance means giving up the dangerous hope for their miraculous transformation, and clearly recognizing that the masked predator will absolutely never change. The survivor must slowly collect the shattered pieces of their original identity, carefully reconstructing their entire internal mental world without the toxic viral code. Forgiving oneself for falling into the intricate and deadly psychological trap is the absolute most critical mandatory step toward genuine and lasting recovery. The narcissist thrives completely on creating endless chaotic drama and severe anxiety, making complete profound silence and total indifference their ultimate and absolute kryptonite. Breaking the cycle requires establishing a fortress of completely impenetrable iron boundaries, ensuring the cold, emotional vampire is starved of their vital energetic supply. As the survivor regains their profound capacity for real and deep empathy, the manipulator remains permanently trapped deep inside, a barren wasteland of nothingness. The psychological scars serve as a permanent and heavy defensive armor, guarding the newly awakened, resilient human spirit from any future predatory invasions. The ultimate revenge is not found in exposing their dark, twisted lies, but in achieving complete and absolute apathy toward their pathetic existence altogether. The grand illusion is finally and completely dismantled, piece by broken piece, revealing a tiny and pathetic frightened coward, hiding behind a terrifying mask. The survivor walks away, leaving the empty predator to starve.